It's hard time in the high desert of Walla Walla, Washington. This is where the story ends for many of the Pacific Northwest's most notorious killers.
Judge Kevin Hull ultimately gave them each 4 life sentences without parole.
And whether flying over or driving by, you're left to wonder, what's it like inside? What happened to the worst of the worst, the ones whose crimes are so bad, so shocking, so evil, the ones who justice demands can never be part of a civil society, the ones who ended a life or many. The prison in Walla Walla opened in 1886, a few years before Washington became a state. These are the original prison walls, and within them, 137 years of history. On the northeast corner, you'll find this brick building with locks and a metal door concealing a room that has been the center of decades of controversy about just how far the state should go to punish those who kill others. It's a simple but somber room. Behind the glass, a gurney with straps and buckles where condemned inmates would be given lethal injection. But this setup was only used a few times, most recently in 2010 when Cal Coburn Brown was put to death. For most of the 106 years that this room was in use, this was simply the lower half of the gallows. Of the 78 death sentences carried out in this execution chamber, nearly all of them were death by hanging. These hooks were where the rope was attached, and you can see they're worn from use. These wood panels conceal the trapdoors where inmates were put to death. The last hanging happened here in 1994. But Washington didn't just struggle with how to kill inmates who were sentenced to death. Much like other states, Washington went back and forth on whether the death penalty should be used at all. After 1960, only 7 inmates were put to death, and in 2014, Governor Jay Inslee issued a moratorium on the death penalty, saying if any cases were brought to his desk, he would issue a reprieve. Inslee said he believed the law was applied unequally, and 4 years later, the Washington Supreme Court agreed. In the case of the state of Washington v. Gregory, the court ruled the death penalty was, quote, imposed in an arbitrary and racially biased manner. In 2023, the state legislature wiped the statute from state code, and here in Walla Walla, on a late summer day in 2024, Governor Inslee came back to the Washington State Penitentiary to close the death chamber.
This is a historic day in the state of Washington.
Inslee called the death penalty in Washington a fatal lottery.
We found that the death penalty was unfairly administered, unequally administered, and basically we're telling people for the same crime, one person would die and one would live. And this happened repeatedly in our system of justice until this moratorium.
Because of how expensive death penalty cases are, only a few counties had the resources to pursue them, not just to prosecute, but also to pay for the defense and potentially decades of appeals.
The same crime on one side of a county line would end up with the state government killing that citizen, and on the other state side of that county line, that person would live. That disparate system is untenable.
Inslee toured the execution chamber and these cells where inmates spent their final day. The prison superintendent showed him the trapdoors and the gallows and this plaque that commemorates the official closure and the final chapter of the death penalty in Washington.
So at the moment, it's going to stay intact.
A Pew Research poll in 2021 showed a majority of Americans still support the death penalty for murderers, but that number has been decreasing.
People fantasize about the death penalty that they wish that we had in our state, not the one that we actually have.
Dan Satterberg was the last prosecutor to successfully try a death penalty case in Washington when Cal Coburn Brown was put to death for the rape, torture, and murder of Holly Washa. Satterberg was with Washa's family through the trial, the appeals, and the execution here at the prison.
We watched him die, and then Holly's sister turned to me and said, well, now we don't have to think about him anymore. And I realized that for the last 2 decades, they were worried that some court somewhere was going to let him out or make us do the trial again, because death penalty litigation it never ends, and it goes on for decades. This case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, it went to federal courts throughout the land and through the state court system. And that closure, if you will, or that finality of the death penalty could also be achieved through a life sentence without possibility of release. And that's what Cal Brown could have gotten in 2 to 3 years. We had the whole process would have been over, appellate courts would have sealed the deal, and then he would have been no longer something they had to worry about.
Satterberg said after witnessing Brown's execution, he believed the state would be better off without the death penalty.
As a political matter, it was still a very uphill climb, because legislators, like everybody else, they have this fantasy of this is how the death penalty is, and this is who should get it, and it'll be quick and fast, and we'll all feel better afterwards. That's not at all how the death penalty in our state works.
Satterberg also worked in the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office during the case of Gary Ridgway, known as the Green River Killer. Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated murder and disclosed the locations of victims' bodies in exchange for prosecutors not pursuing the death penalty against him. And while the death penalty deal may have worked in Ridgway's case, Satterberg says it's a dangerous game to play for prosecutors.
I think using the death penalty as a bargaining chip is another reason why you shouldn't have it. You shouldn't force people to plead guilty or face the death penalty, because people will plead guilty to things that they didn't do in order to avoid the death penalty. It's way too strong of a punishment to be used in that way.
Satterberg says good riddance to the death penalty, and he's glad to see the execution chamber move into Washington history.
It hadn't been used very often, but it had been promised all the time that this was going to make us safer. This room, what was going to happen in this room was going to make us safer. It set up expectations that this was going to happen, and it was going to happen quickly and certainly, and that it would be fair and we would be over, and none of those promises could be kept. Having lived with it for more than 3 decades and tried to make it work, I know that it just collapsed under its own weight here. It's too expensive, too slow, and not helpful to the victims at all, and really an impediment to the entire justice system. So it's gone. Good riddance. Seal it up. We can talk about it. We can watch the rest of the country struggle with it. I expect the rest of the country is going to give up the death penalty within the next 10 or 15 years too.